Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to what will hopefully be a very lively and entertaining 45 minutes where we're going to be looking at international ownership and investment within the business of football. My name is Trevor Watkins. I'm the head of sports at Pinsent Mason's international law firm and lifelong AFC Bournemouth supporter. We used to play some of the teams in front of us here, but now in the Premier League, so seeing lots of changes of ownership ourselves. But I think in terms of the guests, however, that we have today, they far outstrip my background. Delighted that we have with us Mr. Wael Al Qadi, the owner of Bristol Rovers Football Club, Marcus Shebolt from Vermilion Partners, who guided the Chinese investment into West Bromwich Albion, Premier League football team, and Paul Bell, who, as was described by other panel members, as one of the members of the British aristocracy of football, who Paul, I mean, you are the executive director at Leeds United, but you've been through 7 owners?
Yes, I've been in football club business for 12 years or so, and during that time managed to, work under 7 different ownerships, mainly overseas owners during that time. I think it's a world record.
There's anybody, we're going to be verifying that by 1 o'clock today. Who was your favourite?
There's a question.
No pressure.
The breadth of owners that I've worked under is very varied. It's difficult to point out a favourite particularly because they've all been in very different stages of different clubs' life cycles. Going back to the early days at Portsmouth under Milan Mandrić, into Alexander Gajdamak. There's a gentleman called Sulaiman Al Fahim that bought the club late in my time at Portsmouth. Then moved to work at Leeds under the ownership and stewardship of Ken Bates, which is interesting. Then into GFH, then into Massimo Cellino. Did a 15-month sabbatical at Sheffield Wednesday under Milan Mandrić again, then into Stefan Chansiri, and then back to Leeds for Massimo and obviously at the moment Andrea Radrizzani.
And Paul's book will be out at Christmas. But in all seriousness, for you, international ownership has been a facet of your career for the last 10 years or so.
Absolutely, absolutely, a big part of it. And it's clear that there's going to be growing involvement from overseas ownership as we move forward. That's very clear. And I think any major club now is likely that overseas ownership and investment will be prevalent. Working under different owners, culturally, the differences are vast. And one of the immediate challenges with any new ownership from overseas is understanding the individuals, the cultures, even the basics of how they want to be communicated with, and also their expectations.
Wael, from your perspective, impressed to see pictures of you, your promotion into League One, celebrating with the fans, standing on the away end. Why Bristol Rovers? Was that the first club you looked at? Well, why did you end up there with your family investing?
Well, anybody that knows me, I've always been passionate and interested in football, and I wanted basically to find a club that ticked all the boxes, had the potential, was fundamentally strong as a football club, had a loyal, strong fan base. So the opportunity came up, and we acquired the club, and here we are.
Tell us a little bit more about Bristol as a club. I mean, obviously one of 2 clubs in the city. Mm-hmm. What were its hallmark qualities that attracted you, apart from the passionate fan base?
Well, the city is the 2nd largest city in the south after London. It has, like I said, huge potential to go places. The club was in a kind of bad situation when we took over. The only way for the club was upwards. So, like I said, it ticked all the boxes for us to get involved in English football with Bristol Rovers.
And the objective for you of getting involved?
Well, the objective is to basically build the club up and go on a journey where we can be successful, get the right infrastructure in place, produce a good training facility for all our academy, the development squad, the first team, and regenerate the stadium. That's very important to enhance, fans' experience and provide them with a stadium where they can enjoy their football.
I mean, Marcus, perhaps in similar vein, we're seeing West Midlands, Birmingham, almost becoming a nucleus of Chinese ownership of football in the United Kingdom. You, with your business based in England and also with your offices in China, have worked very closely with the Chinese investment group coming into West Bromwich Albion. Perhaps it'd be useful for the audience to share a little bit about the rationale, why that was the club they chose to invest into, and why they wanted to be involved in English football.
Yeah. So I suppose there's a sort of a compound question there. And I think you've really got to start with China and what's going on there. There's a massive increase in sport as an industry in China. It's the national plan to take the income from sport up to 5 trillion RMB within the next 10 years, which is a tenfold increase. To put that in pounds, that's 500 billion pounds. So increasing from about 40 billion pounds to 500 billion. So huge growth available. And football is expected to be a large component of that. So if you're looking at building a commercial proposition to take advantage of that, then owning a club in what is arguably the best league in the world is a good starting point. I mean, our guys were particularly interested in the training academy. They wanted to take the model and the system that West Brom have and take it back to China. And they've already started doing that with launching some training academies over there. And with it, hopefully, it will increase the profile of West Brom in China, which should lead to more sort of sponsorship and commercial opportunities for West Brom. In terms of why West Brom, West Brom's a sort of Goldilocks club. If there are sort of three, if you start off with the premise that you want to invest in a Premier League club, there are sort of three broad strategies that you could employ. You could either look at one of the top 6 clubs, which are very expensive and in some ways a bet on media rights values moving forwards. You can invest in a club like West Brom, which is a solid mid-table club. Hopefully won't get relegated, well run. But there are still opportunities to improve the club, and particularly its profile internationally. And then the third possibility is to take more of a risk and bet on a Premier League club staying up, or trying to invest in a Championship club and bring it up into the Premier League. So those are the sort of the 3 strategies that we looked at, and the West Brom fitted perfectly with what our client was looking for. It's a well-run club, pretty solid. You can never guarantee that you're going to stay up, but there was a good chance that we would do.
And there's been a fair amount of media coverage about the influence Chinese government has over decisions made by investors in the country, businesses looking to where they go and where they put their money. Is that boulder dash? Is it going to impact on, well, perhaps not the specifics of West Brom?
Yeah, so I think in some ways it's true, because China is still a policy-driven economy to a large extent. So if the government says, look, this sector of the economy is going to grow for sport, for social cohesion, to rebalance the economy, to move our economy away from exports and create our own domestic economy, people recognise that, and it almost becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Before the government does anything else, investment flows in to that sector and it begats further industry. There's also government policy to support it. There's been quite a lot of deregulation that's gone on within the industry in China. So, for example, it used to be the case that the television rights got sold to the national broadcaster, CCTV, and that they paid about £8 million annually for those rights. That they've just been sold to an investment group for a large multiple of that. So it's around £800 million. So there's a lot going on in China at the moment that is prompted by the government but not directed by it.
We'll look at the future, and we'll come back to that in terms of what policy and how it might influence later. But for you, Paul, your ultimate owner has a number of businesses in the media world. Perhaps could you share some of the strategy as to why Leeds United? Obviously, it's a great club. I remember it for its heydays in the 1970s onwards. Why Leeds?
I think everybody over the last 10 years has looked at Leeds and seen the potential in the football club. It's a one-club city, big city in the UK. It's got a significant fan base, big heritage, and if we can get it right, and through the last sort of 10, 12 years, it's been some challenging times, let's say, then there's huge potential in Leeds United, particularly if we can get back to the Premier League. Even now, over the last 12 months, we're seeing real change in the mood of the city, the fans, the people, the wider football community in respect of Leeds. The optimism that's there now, we're seeing that in real terms. There's more fans coming through the door. We've got record numbers of season tickets this year, the highest we've ever had outside the Premier League. Record hospitality, record shirt sales. So things at the moment, touch wood, are particularly good.
And if you compare, well, your background, Bristol Rovers, clearly the success in your first season, was it 4 months after coming in you got promoted?
Yes.
I mean, obviously that helps. But in terms of building the relationship with the fans, I remember when I grew up watching Bournemouth play, if you talked about international ownership, that might have been sort of Welsh or Scottish. If you now look at it and the way the world is, we went through a phase of international ownership being associated with shed loads of money coming in, you're going to spend it all on players. The world's changed a bit. How are you looking to build the business and relationship with the fans, not just domestically?
Well, when we took over, we said we want to build up the club in a sustainable way, and it's evolution, not revolution. And we've gone about it quietly, slowly but quietly. So the fans appreciate that. It's not about wasting or spending money on certain aspects of the game that might get you short-term success, but we're after long-term success.
And interestingly, there are not that many owners from the UAE, Middle East region that have come into English football. How has it been received in Jordan, in your home country? Obviously, you've got strong links with the Jordan FA.
Well, I mean, overall, I can say that, yes, they're quite excited about it. I mean, you do get some minority that's, well, like, why didn't you buy a club in Jordan? Why in the UK? But overall, they're pretty excited to follow our news.
Right. There's been a lot of stuff in the media. We won't touch on individual owners and circumstances that have been commented on as to the Football League, Premier League's approach to ownership. But Marcus, you've been through that sort of painful process of getting approval for Chinese owners of the Premier League. But could you shed a little bit of light on that and how it actually works for the audience?
Right. Well,
to the extent you can.
Yeah, sure. So obviously, I suppose there's three elements. Firstly, is it a sensible deal to do? And there's plenty of homework done on that front, and actually, we were very pleased with what we found when we looked under the covers at West Brom. We managed to come to an agreement with Jeremy Peace, the former owner, who it took some convincing of the credibility of our client, and I think rightly he was relatively sceptical. There'd been an awful lot of approaches for his business over the years, and he set a fairly high bar. And actually, his attitude towards it also helped with the Premier League. So the third aspect is getting the approval from the Premier League, and we presented the Premier League with a business plan, which included possibility of relegation and what we would do about that. We gave them details of what we intended to do with the management structure. We provided them all with the details of exactly where the money was coming from and how, and verified all of that. And they also did some background checkings on our guys as well. So from my perspective, I thought it was quite a thorough process that the Premier League ran to ascertain our bona fide as a purchaser.
It's interesting. I mean, Paul, again, I know we won't talk about specifics of ownership. The article coming out, Henry Winter wrote today about derelictions of duties and who actually should be properly taking up the mantle of deciding ownership. Do you think we've got it right in this country in terms of looking at the tests you have to comply with to be an owner of a club, be a director of a club?
I think the league has a set of criteria that it stipulates for any prospective owner. Are they right? Are they wrong? It's a very subjective matter. They're in place to protect the competition, protect the league. So it's a very difficult question to answer yes or no.
But Wael, from your perspective, you've been through the process as well. Is there any light you'd like to add to it?
Well, they accepted me, so so it's a flawless process. Yeah, I mean, they're pretty strict, and they do backup checks. And, you know, these days you have compliance everywhere, and it kind of sets the tone for prospective owners here.
Again, Marcus, being new to the industry, I'm interested in your view when you look over history at the different types of ownership, whether it's international or domestic. Do you think we're seeing a shift in the type of owner that is coming into the English game?
Yeah, I think it's probably just a reflection of football maturing as a business. So I think, you know, if you go way back, there were a lot of people that owned football clubs for purely emotional reasons. And I mean, you never take emotion out of football. If somebody wants to buy the football club and they've got the means to do it, they'll buy it. Yeah, I think a lot of the new owners that are coming into the game, the ownership of the football club is one element of a broader sports business strategy. And you know, that has pluses and minuses that come with it, but I suppose at its core, it's likely to lead to more stability because the decisions are rooted in business rather than emotion. And that's an observation that just looking at the history of recent transactions.
Well, in terms of the way you've approached Bristol Rovers and your budgeting and the way you've looked at your playing squads and so on, do you find things easier now than it would have been in the past with the likes of the various financial regulations on your club to be able to plan for the future?
No, I mean, it's never easy. I mean, you have to. For us, we're building up a club from scratch. We went in there. There was just the first team and the academy. There was no, and all the squads were understaffed. So we worked on getting the proper staff in place. Now we have a very good academy, well staffed. We created a development squad, and the first team is fully equipped now and has a very good backroom staff. So, like I said before, we're working on the training ground. So it's about building it up slowly, and I believe that once you have everything in place, that's when you can start having something that's sustainable and your squads can actually compete properly.
And because Wael is looking to join your league and you're looking to join Marcus's league and Marcus is looking to be a top 8 established club. And for you, Paul, the last transfer window, how hard or easy was it for Leeds United against this background of soaring values and increasing demands?
I think you look at I'm not directly involved in the transfer side, Trevor, but looking from a close proximity to it, with our ownership now, we've invested more in the scouting side of the football club, invested in people, invested in technology to help that process. And you look at the players that Leeds have recruited during the summer and the manager, they are not typical household names, but they've been done against a certain set of criteria to help the process along. It's clear the values you've seen in the market, particularly this summer, are way beyond anybody's expectations, way beyond. And you wonder where that inflation will lead to in terms of pricing.
Interesting, perhaps comparable for you, Marcus, at West Brom. Obviously, you got Oliver Birkin, which was, bringing him back from Germany only a year after he went from Forest. Looks like good business. You're also able to resist various approaches.
Well,
not you personally.
My personal perspective, I was very pleased that Johnny Evans was still with the club. I think it's difficult to do business during the transfer window. I do have a certain sympathy with Tony Pulis's view that the window should close before the season starts. You find that some clubs have to wait for the big clubs to do their business before things start to open up, and it makes it difficult. It's very difficult to get a squad bedded down before the start of a season in those circumstances. So,
And talking generally rather than specifics of West Brom, do you feel that as someone involved in the game that there's a hopelessness about being a top six club, or is it there is a genuine belief that at some point in the future we'll see? I know Leicester was an oddity one year, but do we see that as an outlier, or can we see a season where we start shaking it up at the top six in the Premier League?
I mean, wouldn't it be brilliant if we had 10 clubs at the start of each season that had a chance? I think that would be fantastic for the league.
Do we now?
I'd like to hope so from a West Brom perspective, but I think there is quite a big gulf in spending power between the big clubs and the rest of the league. But spending power only takes you so far. If you find good players in the grassroots, there's no reason why you can't do it if you create the right esprit de corps. Leicester it was terrific for the Football League. It was a really good thing that they won.
Sorry, Paul, did you have something?
Yeah, I think just on the point that Marcus is making, if you look at the Championship division, at the start of each season in the Championship, there's probably 16 clubs.
Hugely competitive.
16 clubs that have a real chance, or would believe they have a real chance of at least making the playoffs. So as a league, I would argue that the Championship is probably one of the most competitive in football.
And arguably very attractive for viewing.
Yeah, the audiences are growing. With the league now, with their new opportunity this season for clubs to stream their games internationally, it's a bigger market now. And to your earlier point about the media opportunity, for a club like ourselves, with an owner such as Andrea, his passion for delivering top-class products, we see growth opportunities of our own media, never mind the broadcast opportunity, as we move forward. So,
can you talk to us a little bit more about this international streaming and what clubs within the Football League can do with their rights on streaming?
Yeah, it's quite an exciting project I follow. It's about basically getting international subscribers to follow your team. And we're trying to work on a strategy where we can basically market this and get people across our region, the MENA region, to be interested in following Rovers and subscribe. Get them interested in the players and how we do, and generate support that way.
Marcus, this emphasis on increasing popularity, you mentioned earlier that perhaps in terms of the perception of why Chinese investors are looking at ownership in England, the ability to grow revenue in China, is that huge, understated? Where do you see the opportunities for West Bromwich Albion?
I think it's substantial. Yeah, I wouldn't want to over-egg it, but I do think it's substantial. I mean, you could easily see that a club, be it West Brom or Southampton, could double their commercial sponsorship income if they get it right in a country like China, and that's quite a lot of extra spending power that drops straight through to the bottom line. So I think we're talking about that sort of quantum rather than doubling the TV income.
And if we're sitting here 2 years from now, in theory, we would have left the European Union, in theory. The potential for impact on your clubs must be considerable, because presumably you've got players you've signed who are members of the European Union that in 2 years' time may not be able to play here. Looking in at the UK, what is the impact of Brexit on any of your planning or your thoughts? Well, is that now crossing Bristol Rovers' desk, or?
Well, for us, I mean, all our players are British, so I think, if anything, that's looking quite positive for us. But nobody knows what's going to happen. So.
And presumably, Paul, slightly different criteria for yourselves, because you would have hoped to be a Premier League club by then.
Yes, that's absolutely the aspiration for the club. the point about Brexit, I think there's so much work to be done to understand what it actually means, not just for football, but for the wider economy. But to Wael's point, I think time will tell how that impacts the club specifically. Yeah, but say hopefully we're in the Premier League by then and things are a little bit easier.
Yeah, I mean, Marcus, I mean, you're signing players this transfer window. All things being equal, we've got 3 transfer windows before Brexit actually takes place. How are you guys going to plan ahead?
Well, I think the Premier League's well aware of the situation, and there is a possibility. I mean, everybody seems to be working from the basis that it's going to get worse. It might not do.
It could get better.
It could get better.
How come?
Well, I mean, if you look at the Premier League as a sort of national asset and the leagues below it, it's an important business for our country, and I think it would be ludicrous for policymakers to damage that in a way. You know, I personally would like to see it open up more. I think it's a good thing. And interesting actually, because the West Brom deal was signed on the day of Brexit. So we woke up to the news that the UK was leaving, and the new owner went ahead and signed the deal.
I mean, it's been interesting again in the last transfer window, a lot of discussion about Neymar, soft power influenced by Middle Eastern governments, soft power influenced potentially by China. I know we touched on it earlier, Marcus. Just be interested in your views generally. Is it still really the individual investors and businesses who are controlling the direction of football?
Yes.
And it's nothing to do with the governments. That's
I mean,
a red herring that makes up media stories.
Well, the government has prompted a policy in terms of trying to develop the industry further in China, and very good reasons for that around social cohesion and the general economic strength of the country. It is not directing X, Y or Z to go off and buy PQ&R Football Club. I had a whole bunch of phone calls when the West Brom deal was announced from reporters. What is it about Birmingham? Is China trying to take over Birmingham? There's a Wolves deal. There's a possibility of the Aston Villa deal. It was just chance that it was West Brom. There is no grand master plan.
So if the government's not, so as far as China's concerned, the government's clearly not trying to take over English football.
No.
That's a very flippant comment. Is it the end of Chinese investment in English football, given recent government proclamations? Are we going to see any more Chinese investment deals, or is that it?
They're a lot more difficult to do now. I think that's definitely the case. And if you look at it from a government perspective in China, China is still a developing economy. And whilst it wants to encourage the development of sport and business, I could see that it might jar spending an awful lot of money on a player or on a club when there's still a lot of work to do at home in terms of raising the average lot of people in the country. So I can understand the sort of sensitivity around it. So I think it will temper. I think it's unlikely that we'll see companies in China buying football clubs outside of China in the immediate future. But you may well see individuals who've got assets offshore concluding deals. That I think is possibility. And as ever with China, things ebb and flow. Today that's the situation. It might not be the case in a year's time.
Well, with your background in the Middle East, what's your view on the outlook for investment from the countries in the region of your home?
Well, I mean, if you look at the football industry as a whole, I mean, just look at the way TV rights are increasing in value. And that alone will attract investors from all over the world. There will be demand from investors for English clubs.
Interested, I mean, Paul, again, from your perspective, Andrea's come in, he's got bases, he's worked in North America, you've got businesses across Poland, Brazil, Belgium, the Far East. For your global aspirations, what are the next steps for you as a club? What is it you're going to really be concentrating on to deliver that growth?
I think with Andrea's business network that he has, Leeds is well known internationally. That's clear. His influence now enables us to have some real platforms in certain key territories for us. Touching on Wael's point before, if you look at our international fan base particularly, we're strong in Scandinavia. In Norway we have a supporters club with 4,000 members, for example. It's how we start to get into those markets and utilising Andrea's connections and business interests to try and grow commercial revenues, income from overseas markets that previously we've never really had the realistic opportunity of facilitating.
Yeah, I mean, if we've got a crystal ball, you would hope that Leeds, given your background, you re-establish it as one of the world's most dominant football clubs. What's the biggest challenge for you?
Getting out of the Championship.
23 other owners that are all seeing the same thing.
Yeah, exactly. And the word sustainability is really important.
What does that mean? What does that mean for Leeds?
Doing things in a proper manner that's well structured, well thought through, well funded. We're not going to take huge risks on gambling on player A or B and putting all our chips in one basket about that guy making such a big difference. The philosophy now is the whole thing is important, the whole club. It's about bringing the first team and the operations staff together closer. Our training ground is about 45 minutes from the stadium. It's a big piece of work about bringing cohesion to the business. Andrea's invested significantly in the infrastructure.
You bought the freehold back?
Bought the stadium back,
yep.
Which is the first time in 13 years that we've had re-owned the stadium, which is hugely significant to the supporters. They see Ellen Road back as our natural home, but back at home again, rather than being a guest. Invested in the infrastructure at the training ground to give our players the best chance. We're investing again in youth football. Further investment in people. I think it's fair to say under the reign of Massimo, the reduction in staff was significant, perhaps to a base level. Andrea's now reinvesting in people, good quality people, into the organisation to help achieve our overall goals.
And Marcus, it sounds like, listening to Paul, listening to Wael, this international ownership is bringing a direction of sustainability, better governance, better way of running things.
I hope so. I mean, I'm sure we can't generalise across the whole market, but I think it definitely has the potential to.
And for you, where you're at in the top half of the Premier League currently,
Yep.
what are the biggest challenges for you as you continue to seek to grow?
I think, without sort of repeating what Paul said, I think it's a question of sustainability. It's just gradually building. We would love it if there was if West Brom could be considered a top half club, and that every club in the top half had a chance of winning the title.
And how, I mean, again, I know with limited involvement on the transfer side, how has that impacted for you the last transfer window on looking to attract the talent to your club?
I'm not engaged in the transfer side on a day-to-day basis, but one observation I would have is that the club seems to have some momentum now. And I think that is really critical to any football club. I think if you've got some sort of positive momentum forwards, it's easier to attract players. And it creates stability, and it all becomes a virtuous circle. I think that's absolutely critical and helpful when it comes to attracting players.
Probably in a similar vein, Wael, in terms of looking at Bristol Rovers in the middle of League One with the aspirations for growth. What are you finding is the greatest challenge for you, having come into the game, or perhaps the greatest surprise having come into the English game?
Well, these guys are signing players for 20, 25 million. We signed the players straight out of the British Army, so to put things into perspective.
Then you can sell him to Marcus. Yeah.
So,
is there a hope that you can compete? I mean, say your aspiration is to get into the Championship. Can Bristol Rovers, in reality, can you be up there top 6 in the Championship?
I mean, we're about. We have a good core group of players. We have a very good young manager. We've kept the squad together. We've added some quality to that group of players. And as long as we keep them together and keep the team going, the momentum is there, and we're very hopeful to compete.
And would you change anything? If you could wave a wand and change anything about the way we run our game here, what is it that you've seen that you think we could do better?
From a footballing perspective, the football
Any
team,
perspective.
I leave the manager to manage. I don't interfere, and I think that's the right way of doing things. But as a club, it's about, again, like the guys have said, doing something sustainable and making sure you avoid the big mistakes that have happened elsewhere.
So overall, we're going into the last 10 minutes. I want to make sure we leave 5 minutes for questions. Two of you are very new to the English game. Paul, you're an old hand. In terms of looking ahead, looking ahead, I'd be interested in closing just to have your thoughts on how you see, just generally your thoughts on how the game is going to develop. For you as a club, we know where you're aiming to be. How do you see the future of the game with investment and the way it's going to grow? Just your general thoughts to share with the audience before we move to questions. Perhaps start off with you, Paul.
I think we're in a good place. I mean, I look at Leeds particularly. We are in a really strong position right now from where we've been. Really strong. And you look at some of the initiatives the league are undertaking.
Such as?
Just think like we mentioned before, things like live international streaming. These are new opportunities for clubs.
It's pioneering.
Pioneering, leading the way. I think the game gets more competitive every season. The Championship particularly with clubs coming down with parachute payments, the financial advantage they have is significant. And for clubs like ours that have not had the benefit of parachute payments, we have to try and be competitive in a clever way. I think the outlook for the game is hugely positive. There is huge interest in the game, that's for sure. That remains. I think there is a growing recognition of the need to be sustainable and to manage clubs in an orderly manner. There are people still willing to risk and shoot for the stars in terms of getting to the Premier League. And you look at Huddersfield last year, as much as it sort of hurts me to say it, they did a fantastic job in getting a club that you would not typically suggest would be a top runner in the Championship to the Premier League through a mentality of teamwork and selection of key players.
Interesting, because Mark, we touched on this earlier. Is the Premier League sustainable as the position it's achieved globally? Because a lot of people obviously were worried about rights values and the way we're going to look at it in the future.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose the accretion in rights values must stop at some point. But having said that, there's still a lot of markets that they can add value in. I think, China being one. So I'm sort of neutral on it. I think I'm not saying that the rights are going to go up in value dramatically over the next 10 years or so. But it's difficult to imagine them going down as well.
But for you then as West Brom and your relationship with the Chinese investment group, what does that look like then? What does the club look like for the next few years?
Well, I think we're reasonably optimistic. I think everybody's quite pleased at how things have transitioned and got going. We're hoping that we can bring to the club some China dimension that's of value to the club, as well as helping to develop the industry within China as well.
Well, then we'll finish with you before we move to questions. For Bristol Rovers?
Well, I'm very optimistic for the future, and you have to give credit to the people who run the leagues, like the EFL and the Premier League. They're doing all they can do, and they're doing their best for the game as a whole, and that will reflect positively on all the clubs. So I'm very optimistic for the future.
So there's no regrets on the panel.
No.
A lot of positiveness. We've got 5 minutes to go. That was really insightful, and thank you very much for your comments. Time for questions. Do we have any questions in the audience? Oh, there's silence in the audience. There's a microphone coming to you. If you could say who you are and where you're from, just in case it's a question I shall moderate.
I'm from BBC Radio and Television. I'm I'm curious about the cultural differences that come in when overseas owners come in. They bring their own, you know, things from their own environment, and how difficult it is to assimilate it into English football clubs.
Perhaps start with you, Paul. You've tried to do, well, you have done that with 7 owners.
Yeah, it's difficult, Mark. I think each of the owners that I've worked under, there's some real variances in how they perceive the football club, ranging from obviously with Sheffield Wednesday, with a Thai owner, very different sort of philosophy around how the club should be managed. Ultimately, as employees of the football club, we have to respect the owner. I found that during my time working under various different ownership, you're trying to explain the existing English model and the rationale behind where we are today. They will always have a view. Some are more receptive than others to discussing that position. But equally, some of the UK owners that we've had have got very clear thoughts, but culturally there's huge variances between different owners that I've experienced.
I mean, well, you've obviously studied here in this country. You know this country well, so in many ways you've been able to bridge the cultural divide.
I grew up, I studied in England, and I was a football fan since, you know, early 80s. And I consider myself as a fan, and that's the way I go about treating things at the club as a fan. And I know a lot about the English game. So culturally wise, I mean, there's no influence at all.
And Marcus, for you, I think very similar to ourselves, you found yourself as pivotal in being that cultural bridge in terms of helping the investors to understand the nuances perhaps of going through an approvals process, or how the fans might react at an English club.
Yeah, I mean, actually, I found our clients to be actually very knowledgeable. They're massive football fans. They've got internal football leagues within their company, so they had an immediate appreciation of the business. There was a good rapport struck up with the outgoing owner, Jeremy Peace, who provided some decent advice. We brought in a really excellent executive chairman in the shape of John Williams, who I think deserves a lot of the credit for
Hugely experienced.
for bedding it all down. So from my perspective, it's gone as well as it could do.
Any other question? Question on the front row here. Well, waiting for the microphone, what I would say is interesting, Mark, is that like we were talking earlier, last 36 hours, we've probably taken 5-6 inquiries from people still looking to buy clubs. So I don't think there's any lack of appetite from ownership groups around the world wanting to be involved in the English game. So microphone's now there.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bumi Janadu, and I run an organization called United Soccer Africa, USA, but we're based in the US. I hear a lot about Chinese investments coming to the UK as far as football is concerned. However, when we're talking international, you know, we can't neglect the fact that the US is also there. And in recent history, we've seen the trifecta of the British invasion into the US, you know, starting with the Beatles in the 80s, secondly with Austin Powers, and thirdly with soccer, you know. The recent success of Atlanta United, headed by somebody that used to work at Tottenham Hotspurs. So my question is, what are you, all three of you, collectively and individually doing to take advantage of what is going on in the present landscape in the US, you know?
So US soccer, what does it mean to Rovers, West Brom and Leeds? What?
The future of US football, soccer, is very bright. I mean, I think their TV rights are going to be increased from $1 billion to an $8 billion contract. So there definitely things are moving in the US now. How can we establish a relationship with an MLS team or a football entity in the US? That remains to be seen and studied. But definitely the future looks really bright for the US.
And is that relevant for you, Paul, with Leeds United? Is it having a partnership with a professional team in the US, or building out the Leeds brand one way or another there?
Possibly. I think we know historically, and we know from our own data, where we have strong support bases already. I think for ourselves, we're now into the planning stage of what do we do medium to long term. Now Andrea is the guardian of the club. I think for ourselves, probably internationally, the easier steps are into the markets where we already have a foothold. Places like, say, Norway, Australia. The US is absolutely a growing market for soccer, but we need to really think through how we approach the market in the US.
And Marcus, I mean, from a West Brom perspective, in the NBC coverage of the Premier League, probably your shirt sales have shot up in the US. But apart from Charlie inviting you to be part of the ICC, hopefully next year, a successful season, what else?
There's a lot of growth available in the States. Everybody recognises that. I think all of the sort of modern day owners of football clubs will be looking to take advantage of that in some way. I know certainly it is in the minds of the current owners of West Brom.
Do we have one last question? We'll have two last questions. Right, we'll keep I can see Rob Harris's hand is up, so that's a media question. We'll hear that one. And then there's one last question here from gentleman.
Yes, my name is Henry from the Football Business Academy. We're talking about China investing in Europe. What about the other way around? Europe investing in China and helping developing the football in China?
I mean, Marcus, sounded like a key idea that, and certainly you, based on your experience, Chinese are looking to take the know-how, build academies up.
Yeah, and there already have been some clubs have made investments within China to build, often in cooperation with Chinese entities, training academies. I think there are opportunities for businesses in sport within China.
And UKTI have got a Chinese business delegation here this week, again looking to forge links and bring investment in.
Yeah.
Do you see that, Paul? Leeds looking at China, academies, training camps?
Possibly. I mean, Andrea's business network extends not specifically to China, but to Singapore and Asia. Absolutely part of our long-term thinking is how we establish ourselves in international markets. How we do that needs to be thought through carefully, with some longevity to it. You see teams turn up for a tour, play a game, disappear. It's great, but what actually is the longevity behind that? So there's a whole series of thinking that needs to be done still to answer your question, really.
Well, are we actually moving towards, it's not so much international ownership, but global ownership? It actually means that nationality of an owner doesn't actually really matter anymore.
No, I'm just thinking, how about a pre-season fixture in China? Yeah, I mean, it's important, and of course, being from Jordan, I'm sure Jordan will benefit from our ownership of Bristol Rovers, and be it by, maybe exchanging expertise, sending experts their way to try and improve things in Jordan too. So it goes both ways.
Last question, Rob Harris, Associated Press there. I see you smiling, so this is your...
Do the introduction for me there. It's, since we mentioned the International Champions Cup, I was just wondering if you sort of envisage something like that for clubs ever being sort of a significant trophy you want to win, other competitions like it sort of end up sort of becoming more important financially in terms of football as well, sitting alongside the current leagues, whether at the Premier League level or even sort of clubs lower down the leagues actually playing these competitions around the world.
Pre-season, US, big competitions. Interesting because, of course, it's nothing to do with UEFA, FIFA. Yeah. It's a privately owned entity. Thoughts?
Oh, well, that's above my pay grade, I'm afraid.
I don't think you're going to get much out of there, Rob, so we'll just have one more. There's a gentleman in the back row. We'll finish that if you give him the microphone, and then we'll wrap up for lunch.
Hello, my name is Sharif. I'm from Lagos City FC. Whilst we're just on the matter of international, someone has spoken about China, someone has spoken about America. I just want to know what the perspective of the panel is on African football as a whole, both from a playing perspective and from a business perspective. Thank you.
Well, obviously, Leeds have got strong links with Africa. Some of the playing staff there. Are you active in Africa at present?
Depending in terms of playing staff, yes. Obviously, we recruit players from Africa and have done over the past seasons. in terms of being proactive, in terms of growing the business and growing our brand within Africa. There's nothing today. We look at, again, part of the earlier answer, we're looking now across the globe, being strategic and saying, okay, for a club like Leeds United that has got international recognition, where do we go next? Where can we grow our brand in a clear, logical, sustainable way overseas with some longevity, as opposed to just, say, turning up? We've talked internally about soccer schools, international academies. It's all part of that whole thinking at the moment. So we are very much aware of Africa and the continent and some of the opportunities that also presents.
But it's demand driven, so when the opportunity, you'll do
We
that
will
in
do it
time.
at the right time, yeah.
And presumably that's very much the same for you, Wael, and for Marcus, your own clubs.
Yes, I mean, we have our development squad, and we are actively looking for players to come in for trials and break into that team. So be it from Africa, from other areas of the world, it's part of our plans.
Yeah. Thank you very much indeed, Wael, Marcus, Paul. Very insightful, very entertaining. Time for lunch. Thank you very much all for coming.